Montana Territory, December 1875. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the valley as Xavier stared at the lonely stretch of road leading to his ranch. At 25, he had already learned what most men twice his age knew, that the Montana frontier gave little and took much, especially in winter. His breath clouded before him as he adjusted the worn leather gloves that barely kept the biting cold at bay. No mail coach today, he muttered to himself, though he wasn't sure why he bothered checking. Nobody would be writing to him anyway. Hayes turned his stallion back toward the ranch, the animal's hooves crunching through the fresh snow. The mountains loomed dark and imposing against the white landscape, a reminder of how small and insignificant a man was out here. He had built his ranch from nothing over 3 years of backbreaking work, and while Broken Pine was modest compared to some, it was his. Just his. And that was how it would stay. Love and family were luxuries the frontier didn't afford men like him. His parents had taught him that lesson when fever took them both during his first Montana winter. At 22, he'd buried them beneath the great pine that gave the ranch its name, and with them, he'd buried any notions of happiness beyond mere survival. The frontier was no place for softness. Every tender feeling made a man vulnerable, and vulnerability got you killed out here where nature and outlaws showed no mercy. Better to focus on building something that would last. Stone and timber didn't break your heart. As he approached the main house, a sturdy 2-story structure that he'd finished just last summer, Hayes spotted his foreman, Emmett, waving frantically from the porch. "What now?" Hayes grumbled, spurring his horse forward. "Boss," Emmett called out, his weathered face creased with concern. "Mail coach broke down about 4 miles east. Driver just rode in on one of the horses. Says he's got a passenger, a young woman bound for Clearwater. With the pass already snowed in, she can't make it through till spring." Hayes felt his jaw tighten. "And what exactly is that to me?" "She needs shelter, boss. Nearest town's 20 miles. Driver asked if we might put her up till arrangements can be made." "We're not a hotel, Emmett." The older man's expression hardened. "It's Christmas Eve, Hayes. You want a woman freezing to death on your conscience." The words struck Hayes like a physical blow. He wasn't heartless, just practical. But even he couldn't turn away someone in need during Christmas. Not in this weather. "Fine," he conceded. "Send Thomas with the wagon. But make it clear this is temporary. First break in the weather, she moves on." 2 hours later, Hayes stood in his parlor as the front door swung open, letting in a blast of frigid air and swirling snow. Thomas entered first, carrying 2 modest trunks. Behind him came a figure so completely bundled in layers of coat, scarf, and blankets that Hayes couldn't make out more than a pair of bright eyes. "This here's the boss, Miss Ainsworth," Thomas said, setting down the luggage. "Mr. Hayes, Xavier." The figure unwound a woolen scarf from her face, and Hayes felt something in his chest shift uncomfortably. She couldn't have been more than 20, with a heart-shaped face framed by waves of honey-blonde hair escaping from beneath her bonnet. Despite the cold turning her cheeks and nose pink, her hazel eyes held a determined spark that caught him off guard. "Tessa Ainsworth, Mr. Xavier," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I cannot thank you enough for your hospitality. I assure you I won't impose for long." Hayes took her hand briefly, then stepped back. "As soon as the weather clears, the driver will take you to Clearwater." She nodded, unbuttoning her coat to reveal a simple but well-made blue traveling dress. "I understand completely. I'm merely grateful not to be spending Christmas in an overturned mail coach." "Mrs. Porter will show you to a room upstairs," Hayes said, already turning away. "We dine at 6. "It's Miss, actually," she corrected softly. "And again, thank you." Hayes paused, struck by the quiet dignity in her voice. He gave a curt nod without looking back, then strode from the room. Having a beautiful young woman under his roof was precisely the kind of complication he didn't need. Especially one whose gentle manner stirred forgotten longings he'd rather keep buried beneath the Montana snow. That evening at dinner, Hayes learned that Tessa Ainsworth was 20 years old and had traveled all the way from Boston to marry a man she'd never met, a widowed shopkeeper in Clearwater who had advertised for a mail-order bride. "You're traveling across the country to marry a stranger?" Hayes asked incredulously, forgetting his resolve to maintain a polite distance. Tessa met his gaze steadily. "My parents died last year. I have no family, no inheritance, and few prospects in Boston." Mr. Crawford's letters were kind. He promised a good home and respectful treatment. That's all you want from life? A good home and respectful treatment. A flash of something, defiance, perhaps, crossed her features. What I want, Mr. Xavier, is a chance to build something meaningful. Boston held nothing but memories and closed doors. Here. She gestured to the window where snowflakes danced in the darkness. Here I can start anew. Is that not why most come west? Hayes fell silent, struck by the echo of his own motivations in her words. Still, rushing headlong into marriage with a stranger seemed foolhardy at best, dangerous at worst. You know nothing about the man, he finally said. The frontier changes people. Men especially. Perhaps, she agreed, her voice softening. But sometimes hope is all we have, Mr. Xavier. And I'd rather risk disappointment than live safely without trying at all. Hayes had no answer for that. Hope was a luxury he'd long since abandoned. 3 days passed, and the snow continued to fall, trapping Tessa at Broken Pine Ranch. Despite his initial reluctance, Hayes found himself drawn to her quiet determination. She didn't sit idle, instead offering to help Mrs. Porter with household tasks and even attempting to teach the cook's young daughter to read during the long winter evenings. On the 5th day, Hayes found Tessa in the small ranch library, running her fingers lovingly across the spines of the few books he'd collected. You enjoy reading, he observed from the doorway. She turned, a smile lighting her face. Very much. My father was a professor before his investments failed. Books were the one luxury he never denied us. She pulled out a volume of poetry. Whitman. I wouldn't have expected this on a cattle ranch. Hayes felt his ears warm. My mother loved poetry. She read to me every night, even after working the fields all day. She sounds remarkable. She was, Hayes said softly, surprised at how easy it was to speak of his mother with Tessa. Both my parents were. They built this place from nothing but dreams and hard work. Like you're doing now, Tessa observed. Hayes shifted uncomfortably. I merely continued what they started. That takes courage too, Mr. Xavier. Carrying on alone. The perceptiveness in her gaze unsettled him. He changed the subject. Have you had any word from your fiancé? Tessa's expression clouded slightly. No, but I wouldn't expect to. Not with the passes closed. And if he's changed his mind? If he's not waiting when spring comes? Her chin lifted. Then I shall find work in Clearwater or move on to another town. I didn't come west expecting guarantees, Mr. Xavier. Hayes found himself admiring her resolve despite his misgivings. Call me Hayes, he said impulsively. If you're to be stuck here until the thaw, we might as well dispense with formalities. Her smile returned, warming the room more effectively than the crackling fire. Hayes, then. And I'm Tessa, not Miss Ainsworth. That night, for the first time in years, Hayes dreamed not of loss and struggle, but of honey-blonde hair and determined hazel eyes. As Christmas approached, the atmosphere at Broken Pines softened. Hayes found himself making excuses to be inside rather than out with the cattle. He watched as Tessa transformed the austere ranch house with simple decorations, pine boughs gathered from near the house, ribbons salvaged from her trunks, and paper snowflakes she taught the ranch hands to cut during evening gatherings. Christmas was always special in my family, she explained when Hayes questioned the effort. Even during difficult times, we found ways to celebrate. It seems a waste of energy, Hayes said, though without conviction. Tessa smiled, that knowing smile that increasingly disarmed him. Joy is never wasted, Hayes. Especially in hard places. On Christmas Eve, disaster struck. Hayes returned from checking the cattle to find the ranch in uproar. One of the hands raced toward him as he dismounted. It's Mrs. Porter's girl, boss. She wandered off 2 hours ago. We've been searching, but with this snow. Hayes felt cold fear grip him. Little Sarah was only 6. Too young to survive long in the brutal Montana winter. Organize search parties. Every man who can ride. Check the creek first. She's always sneaking down there. As the men scrambled to obey, Hayes turned to find Tessa already bundled in her coat, pulling on gloves. What do you think you're doing? Helping, she said simply. I'll search the barn and outbuildings while you men take the horses. You don't know the property, Hayes argued. Then give me a map in my head. Quickly. The determination in her eyes brooked no argument. For the next 3 hours, they searched as daylight faded and temperatures plummeted. Hayes had never felt such dread, not since the fever had taken his parents. When he returned to the house to check if others had found her, he discovered Tessa missing as well. Panic seized him. "Where is she?" he demanded of Mrs. Porter, who was wild with worry for her daughter. Miss Tessa said she remembered seeing small footprints by the old storage cellar. She went to check. Hayes cursed under his breath. The old cellar was dangerous, its wooden doors rotted and its depths a hazard of rusty tools and forgotten equipment. Without hesitation, he raced back into the gathering darkness, fear for both Sarah and Tessa driving him forward through the knee-deep snow. He found them at the cellar, Tessa kneeling by the open doors, calling softly into the darkness below. "Tessa!" he shouted, relief and anger mingling in his voice. She turned, pressing a finger to her lips. "She's down there, Hayes," she whispered as he approached. Scared and cold, but alive. The doors fell shut behind her, and she couldn't push them open. Hayes knelt beside Tessa and peered into the gloom. There, huddled in a corner, was little Sarah, tears frozen on her cheeks. "I'm coming down," he called to her. "Be careful," Tessa warned. The ladders rotted through in places. Working together, they managed to bring Sarah safely up from the cellar. The little girl clung to Tessa, shivering violently. "You could have been hurt going alone," Hayes said harshly as they hurried back toward the house, Sarah bundled in his coat. "You should have waited for me." "There wasn't time to wait," Tessa replied, her voice firm despite her own shivering. "She might have frozen before you returned." "You don't understand how dangerous." "I understand perfectly well," Tessa interrupted. "But some risks are worth taking, Hayes. For the things that matter." Her words stayed with him long after Sarah had been reunited with her mother and the ranch had settled back into relieved celebration. That night, as the ranch hands gathered in the main house to share a Christmas Eve meal, Hayes watched Tessa across the room. She sat with Sarah on her lap, telling a Christmas story that had everyone, even the most hardened cowboys, listening with rapt attention. Something unfamiliar expanded in his chest, a warmth he'd denied himself for too long. This woman, who had arrived with nothing but hope and determination, had shown more courage in a few weeks than he had in years. While he had been building walls, she had been building bridges. The next morning, Christmas Day, Hayes rose early and walked to the pine tree where his parents were buried. The snow had stopped, and the world glittered in crystalline stillness. "I've been a fool," he said softly to the graves, "thinking that closing myself off was honoring what you built. You didn't come west to hide from life, but to find it." He stood in silence for a long moment, feeling something shift and settle within him. Then he turned and walked purposefully back to the house. He found Tessa alone in the kitchen, preparing breakfast. "Merry Christmas, Hayes," she said, her smile making his heart race in a way that no longer frightened him. "I have something for you," he said, holding out a small package wrapped in brown paper. Surprise flickered across her face. "For me? But you shouldn't have." "Please," he said. "Open it." Wiping her hands on her apron, Tessa carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a small leather-bound book of Whitman's poetry, the same one she had admired in the library. "Hayes, I can't accept this. It was your mother's. She would have wanted you to have it," he said quietly. "Someone who understands that beauty belongs even in rough places." Tessa looked up at him, her hazel eyes bright with emotion. "Thank you. This means more than I can say." Before he could respond, the front door burst open, and Emmett rushed in, his expression grim. "Riders coming," he announced. 6 men heavily armed. Hayes felt the momentary peace shatter. "Get the men, and keep Tessa inside." Minutes later, Hayes stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching as the riders approached. Behind him, the ranch hands formed a defensive line, tense and ready. The lead rider, a barrel-chested man with a thick beard, reined in his horse. "Looking for a woman," he called out. "Mail-order bride bound for Clearwater. Name of Tessa Ainsworth." Hayes tightened his grip on the rifle. "What business do you have with her?" The man produced a badge. "Marshall Wilson, Montana Territory. Got word from Clearwater. The man she was to marry, Crawford, found dead 3 days ago. Murdered." Hayes heard the sharp intake of breath behind him and turned to find Tessa standing in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "Murdered?" she whispered. "How?" The marshal's gaze shifted to her. "Shot in his store. Robbery gone bad, looks like. But that ain't all, miss. Among his papers, we found letters. From you and others." "Others?" Tessa's voice trembled. Crawford had at least 3 mail-order brides coming, all paid for with deposits. Man was running a scam, taking money from desperate women back east with no intention of marrying any of them. Hayes moved instinctively to Tessa's side as she swayed slightly. What happens to her now? He asked the marshal. The man shrugged. Not my concern. She's got no criminal charges against her. But Clearwater ain't expecting her anymore. That's for certain. After the marshal and his men departed, Hayes found Tessa in the parlor, staring blankly out the window. I was a fool, she said without turning, pinning all my hopes on a stranger's promises. No, Hayes said firmly. You were brave. Braver than most. She turned then, her expression vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. What do I do now? Where do I go? Hayes took a deep breath. Stay. What? Stay here. At Broken Pine. Not as a guest, but as part of what we're building. He stepped closer, emboldened by the truth he could no longer deny. I've spent 3 years telling myself that the frontier is no place for connection. That vulnerability is weakness out here. But watching you these past weeks, your courage, your kindness, the way you bring light wherever you go, I realized I've been wrong. Tessa's eyes widened. Hayes, what are you saying? I'm saying that I've been surviving, not living. Building walls instead of a home. He took her hands in his. I'm not offering marriage, not yet. That would be too soon for both of us. But I'm offering a place. A beginning. A chance to see if what I feel for you, what I think you might feel for me, can grow into something lasting. Tears shimmered in her eyes. And if it doesn't, then you'll have time to establish yourself, make connections in the territory. You'll never be stranded again, Tessa. I promise you that. For a long moment, she was silent, searching his face. Then, with characteristic courage, she squeezed his hands. A beginning, she said softly. Yes. By spring, Tessa had become indispensable at Broken Pine. She taught the ranch children to read, organized a small library for the community, and even learned to ride Western style, accompanying Hayes on short trips to check the herds. The ranch hands adored her, and Mrs. Porter declared her a blessing straight from heaven. But it was the change in Hayes that everyone noticed most. The hardness that had defined him began to soften. He laughed more, frowned less, and for the first time, spoke of the future in terms of we rather than I. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Hayes turned to Tessa. I received a letter today, he said, from the bank in Clearwater. Tessa looked up from her mending, curious. Oh, Crawford's store is being sold. The money will go to repay the women he defrauded. Hayes hesitated. There's something else. The town council is looking for a schoolteacher. They've heard about the work you've been doing with the children here. Tessa set down her sewing. Are you asking me to leave? No, Hayes said quickly, taking her hand. Never that. I'm asking what you want. You came west to build something of your own. I don't want to stand in the way of that. Understanding dawned in her eyes. You think I feel obligated to stay, don't you? After everything that happened. Tessa shook her head, a tender smile curving her lips. Hey, Xavier, for a smart man, you can be remarkably dense. I stay because I want to. Because somewhere between Christmas Eve and now, Broken Pine became my home. You became my home. The last barriers around Hayes's heart crumbled. He pulled her gently to her feet and into his arms. I love you, Tessa Ainsworth. I think I have since that first dinner when you talked about hope like it was something real and tangible. It is real, she whispered, her hands resting on his chest. Look at us. Look at what hope built. He kissed her then, beneath the vast Montana sky, with the ranch, their ranch, spreading out around them. When they finally parted, Hayes pressed his forehead to hers. Marry me, he said simply. Not because you need a place or because I need help with the ranch. Marry me because we're better together than apart. Because I want to build not just a ranch, but a life with you. Tessa's answer was a whispered yes against his lips. They were married in June beneath the great pine tree, with the whole community gathered to witness. As Hayes placed the ring on Tessa's finger, a band of gold with his mother's small diamond, he marveled at how completely his world had transformed. He had thought himself a builder of fences and barns, of tangible things that would last through Montana winters. But Tessa had taught him to build something far more enduring, a life where love wasn't a vulnerability, but the greatest strength a man could possess. That Christmas, as they decorated their home and prepared to host the entire ranch for dinner, Hayes found Tessa standing by the window, one hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. Their first child, due in the spring. "What are you thinking?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind. She leaned back against him, content. "I was thinking about last Christmas. How I arrived with nothing but hope in my heart." Hayes pressed a kiss to her temple. "And now?" Tessa turned in his arms, her face radiant with joy. "Now I have everything." Hope became home, became family, became love. Outside, snow began to fall gently across Broken Pine Ranch, covering the land in pristine white. Not a barrier keeping the world at bay, but a clean page on which their story, still being written, would continue to unfold.